So, in this video, I want to talk about this really weird economic thing that only happens in Japan. You know, Japan's always been seen as this super advanced place with a really well-organized society, a rich cultural history, and all that cool pop culture stuff that we all love. But there's actually some serious issues with their economy that people don't really know about, and it could really mess up their future. Did you know that in Japan, more than a third of parents are over 65 years old and fewer young people are joining the workforce each year? And to make things even more complicated, the population is shrinking because there are fewer births compared to deaths. It's a tough situation, especially considering that Japan's work culture is super conservative, with a focus on hierarchy and seniority. On top of that, the bureaucracy is complicated, making it hard to come up with new ideas. All of this is taking a toll on young Japanese workers, both financially and emotionally, with depression rates skyrocketing. So in this video, we'll take a closer look at the fascinating economic issues of Japan. Let's discuss them one by one. Japan's population has been declining over the past 4 years due to a decrease in the birth rate. In 1973, there were 2 million babies born in Japan every year. But now, in 2022, it's only projected to be 800,000. That's a big drop, right? To make matters worse, the number of deaths is twice the birth rate. So basically, 800,000 people are lost in just 1 year.
Japan is facing a demographic crisis. The Southeast Asian country witnessed a massive drop in its population last year. What does the data say? Population fell in all 47 prefectures of Japan in 2022. The total drop stood at over 800,000.
Ideally, each woman in Japan would have 2 children to maintain the population, but the current ratio of babies per woman is only 1.3. This has resulted in the closure of many schools each year due to a lack of students. Plus, many houses in remote areas of Japan remain abandoned and uninhabited. Here's an interesting fact. More diapers are sold for the elderly than for babies. If this continues, Japan's population is estimated to decrease to 53 million by the end of 2100. That's a big concern. It could also burden the younger generation with economic dependency.
少子化は我が国の社会経済全体に関わる問題であり、先送りのできない待ったなしの課題であるとの思いから。
Currently, 1/3 of the population is elderly, meaning that 1 in 3 Japanese citizens is no longer able to contribute productively to the workforce. Around 40% of Japanese companies are still hiring employees age 70 or older. That's crazy, right? And it gets even wilder. By 2060, if this trend keeps up, half of Japan's population will be seniors. That's like 1 out of every 2 people.
Let's now look at how Japan is dealing with a shrinking and aging pool of workers to fill jobs in the country. Well, businesses in Japan are trying to develop innovative ways to keep the elderly working longer hours as a result of the country's aging and declining population.
No wonder the government is sweating about paying for their social security and healthcare. They already spend a huge chunk of their budget on these programs, with most of it going to seniors. And guess what? All that money comes from taxes and those pesky national debts that keep growing.
It outlays funding by a large amount of bond sales with a bond dependency ratio of 31.1%. The new budget could add more to Japan's public debt, which tops 2.5 times the size of its economy.
But here's the real head-scratcher. If fewer people are working, who's going to pay for all this stuff? Even the bigwigs at the International Monetary Fund, IMF, are worried, predicting a 25% nosedive for Japan's economy in the next 40 years because of this population problem. The government has tried everything to get people married and having kids, but it's like talking to a brick wall. They even tried bringing in people from other countries, which shows how desperate they are. So, what's the deal? Why are young Japanese people saying no thanks to marriage and kids? That's the big question we'll tackle next. All right, let's talk about the second issue now, the economic and social crisis among young folks in Japan. Over the past 20 to 30 years, Young Japanese have been dealing with a bunch of tricky social problems that are making them feel pretty pessimistic about the future. They're losing interest in starting families or having kids. One big problem is the pressure they're under from society and the crazy work culture. Japan's work culture is all about this Bushido stuff, like the loyalty and dedication you'd see in samurais. This vibe is still heavy in today's professional world in Japan. People are working insane hours, like up to 80 hours a week, with no extra pay for overtime. Plus, there's this thing about hanging out with bosses and coworkers after work, which eats into the little personal time young Japanese folks have.
Japanese people working too much. They work at weekend, but they cannot separate private and working.
Also, the job scene in Japan is super old-fashioned with a big focus on seniority. Basically, no matter how hard the young ones work, it's the older guys who get all the perks. This seniority system is holding back the younger generation. They'd rather wait it out to become seniors themselves than bust their butts now. This loyalty-first culture limits their opportunities and freedom. So, young workers are willing to push themselves to the limit just to keep their jobs.
How many hours do you work in a week?
終電ぐらいまでって言えばいいですかね。
So that's midnight around?
Midnight.
In Japan, working culture can be pretty stressful and demanding. People work long hours and there's a lot of pressure to perform well. This pressure can sometimes get too much and can even lead to death due to overwork, which is called karoshi. It's not uncommon to see young people fainting or sleeping on the streets due to work-related stress.
Karoshi. Now, a government report on the subject says 1 in 5 workers are at risk. Suicide, heart attack, or stroke the main causes. Japanese workers spend much longer hours in the office than those in other countries, and attempts by some companies to create a better work-life balance have come up short.
On top of all this, social expectations are pretty high in Japan. This can be really tough for young people and can lead to something called hikikomori. This is where people withdraw from society and shut themselves away for years. In Japan, around 1.5 million people live like this, which is a lot when you think about it. Another thing in Japan is that many young people still rely on their parents for support. About 17 million young people in Japan still live with their parents, which makes things tough for the economy. The combination of hikikomori and people relying on their parents is a big challenge for Japan's economic growth. Even though Japan had really good economic growth in the 1980s, things aren't looking so good now, and it's hard to turn things around. Let's talk about the third problem, which is Japan's stagnant economy. Back in the 70s and 80s, Japan experienced an incredible economic boom. The Japanese stock market soared, leading its people to invest in stocks without much concern for potential risks, until the economic crisis hit Japan in the 90s. This crisis shattered the Japanese stock market, and the older generation in Japan got super freaked out. Since the collapse of the stock market in Japan, its people have become traumatized and averse to investment, starting businesses, or taking any economically perceived risks. Therefore, the older generation in Japan always advises to keep saving, refrain from spending, avoid debt, shun investment, and refrain from venturing into entrepreneurship. They'd rather be frugal employees who save up all their money. However, this advice has led to a continuous decline in consumption levels in Japan. Consequently, Japan's economy is hindered as its people tend to save and refrain from spending. Prices of goods in Japan tend to stagnate or even decline, which dampens industries and further prompts its people to postpone spending.
もう全く違いますよ。こんなあれじゃないですもん。もう私お嫁に来た頃がちょうど47年前になるんだけど、田舎から出てきて歩くのはこんなんぐらいでしたよ、賑やかで。その当時はね、土日はね、お昼抜きでしたよ。それくらい忙しかったの。
The Bank of Japan has been working hard to lower interest rates as much as possible to get Japanese people to spend more and start more businesses. But the thing is, this strategy doesn't seem to be catching on with the people. Did you know that Japan is ranked 106th out of 190 countries in terms of how easy it is to start a business? And that it's 90th for how easy it is to get credit? These numbers are really low for a country that's so advanced. There are a lot of things holding back Japan's economy, like bad policies around money, not enough taxes being collected, and a budget that's tied up with social security commitments. That's why the government has had to start borrowing money to try and get things moving again, using programs to boost the economy.
Japan is set to unveil an annual budget that maintains spending at historically high levels. The world's most indebted developed nation is expected to present a budget pegged at 112 trillion yen, which is $784 billion. Now, the high spending plan will exert further fiscal stress on Japan.
Japan has been borrowing money like crazy for the past few decades, which is kind of alarming. And get this, by the end of 2022, Japan's debt had reached over 260% of their GDP. That's more than twice their national production capacity.
According to the International Monetary Fund, Japan's government debt has soared to 255% of its gross domestic product. And Japan needs to pay a 6.7% increase to 27 trillion yen in interest payments for its large debt. Now, this reflects the mounting debt burden for Asia's second largest economy.
All these economic problems are connected and have caused Japan to lose a lot of ground on the world stage. Their electronic products aren't as popular as they used to be. And now, everyone's buying stuff from Korea, China, and America instead. Even the Japanese car industry is no longer the top dog. It's having to fight hard to keep up with other countries. When I was a kid, I was really into Japanese stuff. But these days, there are a lot of products from other countries that are just as good and cheaper. Remember when I was talking about that cool Japanese economic issue earlier? There are actually a bunch of other factors that are causing Japan's economy to decline, like the fact that not many people there can speak English well, the Plaza Accord trade agreement that hit Japan hard in 1985, and the politicians who only care about the elderly because they're the ones who vote the most. While there's still so much to explore, I hope this video sparks some valuable insights for all of us. Today, we're diving into the importance of making informed investments and the government's responsibility to craft economic policies that benefit both our present and future generations. What lessons do you think we can learn from Japan's unique economic journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation. See you next time